everyone. Thank you for coming today. I understand the live stream is now joining us. Before we begin with the planned event, I just want to acknowledge what's happening right now in Ukraine and also read the statement from KU's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, CREASE, which I'm the director of. My name is Eric Scott. And we drafted a statement today in support of our colleagues and their families in Ukraine, and also joining our largest professional association in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, ACES, in condemning Russia's military assault on Ukraine and the Russian president's use of historical distortions and cynical lies to justify this attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. We really, at CREASE, truly value our long tradition in Ukrainian culture, history, and language studies. We are really grateful for our long-standing ties we have with the Ukrainian American communities in Kansas and Missouri, our long-standing partnership with Ivan Franko National University in Lviv, and all our thoughts and our prayers are really with our friends and partners and their families during this difficult time. So we really want to stand with the people of Ukraine and also the people of Russia who oppose this war. That said, we're going to shift focus today, but I would argue while we're shifting a chronological focus to the 19th and early 20th century and shifting the geographic focus to Russia's south, we're still talking about empire and as Stephen says, this entangled embrace of empire and the complexities of empire and of Russian empire in particular over the long term. Our speaker today, Stephen Riegg, is an alumnus of KU. He received his bachelor's degree with honors in history and Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies in 2009. He's someone who I heard about as one of KU's big success stories when I arrived here in 2012. And at that point, he had gone on to complete his Ph.D. at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he completed his dissertation in 2016, and since then has been an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M. And I met Stephen, I think, at ACES right around the time when he was starting at Texas A&M, and he told me about this book project, and I was immediately really taken with it and excited about it. And I got a chance to see it in an earlier draft form, and also we talked a lot about KU, so I'm really, really happy to have him back here with us today in Lawrence. This book, Russia's Entangled Embrace, the Tsarist Empire and the Armenians, 1801 to 1914, which Steve will be talking about today, won the Best Book Award at Imperial and also the Armenian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies. So it's really an important contribution to books on the Armenian diaspora in particular, but also the study of empire in general. He did really impressive field work for this book, going to St. Petersburg, Moscow, Tbilisi, and Yerevan. And the book really deals with, I would say, one of Imperial Russia's most interesting and most central diaspora populations, the Armenians, and the way they navigated between the fringes of Russia's empire and its metropolitan centers. And so this book really tries to go beyond the sort of simplistic depictions of empire to really, or sort of reductive questions of whether Russia is a friend or foe of Armenians, to look at Tsarist imperialism and all of its complexity, and look at the ways in which ethnic groups were sort of subdued by empire, but also helped constitute it. It's also a really interesting look at nationalism and its intersection with religious and economic identity. So Stephen is going to give a presentation, then we'll have some time for Q&A. I just want to give a short plug before I turn things over. We do have a number of events coming up to talk about the conflict in Ukraine. Professor Valery Zutsaty of political science will speak next week to the Great Decisions Group. On March 8th, we have Martin Dovjansky of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, who's going to come to KU to talk about the historical perspective on Russian-Ukrainian relations. And on March 31st, Professor Vitaly Chernetsky of Slavic and Eurasian Languages and Literatures will host a screening of the acclaimed Ukrainian film, The Earth is Blue as an Orange, which documents the everyday lives of people living on the front lines of the conflict in eastern Ukraine since 2014. So these are the residents of the Donbass who are often spoken for by politicians. You get to see them and their lives in focus. And this event is going to feature, hopefully, a Q&A with the director of the film, Irina Tsilik. So I encourage you to stay tuned through social media, through our email list. If you're not signed up, let us know. We'd be happy to add you. But today, we have really a lot to talk about with Stephen's book. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to him. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Howdy, as we say in Texas. It is an absolute pleasure to be back. This is probably the friendliest audience I've had for this book talk. I've given it several times with the pandemic in between, but I've never had my family, two of my close friends from college in the audience, and Eric Scott. Eric was very modest when he was introducing my project by mentioning in passing that he glanced at the manuscript stage when I was preparing the revisions. Eric actually agreed to read the entire manuscript as I was in the early stages of revision and provided very extensive, detailed feedback that was absolutely crucial to the book's success. So thank you very much for that, Eric. I also want to thank Ezra for making all the preparations for my trip. It is wonderful to be back here on Mount Oriat after all these years. And finally, on a more somber note, I do want to echo Eric's comments about what's happening right now for those of us who have friends and colleagues and some people have families in Ukraine. This is a very difficult time, and our thoughts are certainly and our sympathies are with them at this moment. So I want to begin by explaining why I wrote this book before I get into what the book is about, and I will finish up with some more general ideas. I want to start by emphasizing that I wrote this book with a wide audience in mind. Specialists will be familiar with the broad contours of the story and even many of the details. However, most of the source material comes from Russian federal and city archives that have not been examined by any scholars working on this topic even since the opening of the Russian archives in the 1990s. At the same time, I think that non-specialists and students in particular could benefit from this study, and that's really the audience that I kept in mind during much of the process. So, what's this book actually about? I want to be clear that rather than a history of Russo-Armenian relations, it's a case study of Tsarist imperialism and the evolution of the Romanov political elite's policies toward Eastern Armenians from Russia's annexation of the Eastern Georgian Kingdom of Kartli-Kakheti in 1801 until the start of World War I in 1914. The majority of my sources are Russian archival documents from the records of the Interior Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the Caucasus Administration in Tiflis or Tbilisi, Moscow city municipal authorities, and various military organs. I conducted about 1.5 years of research in St. Petersburg and Moscow, but only about a month of field work in Yerevan itself. I came to this topic after years of reading mainly Russian language Soviet and post-Soviet scholarship on the theme of Imperial Russia's attitudes toward Eastern Armenians. That was written mainly by ethnic Armenian, but sometimes also ethnic Russian historians. And of course, Anglophone studies, although not as numerous and almost completely lacking Russian archival sources, were also important to me. Over those years, I noticed that we can divide much of this historiography into a couple of crudely essentialized themes, categories. First, many studies portrayed Persian and Ottoman dominion over Armenians as wholly or completely oppressive. It was this very one-dimensional portrayal of this dynamic, starting from the early 18th, going well into the second half of the 19th centuries. 20th century historians, mainly Armenians, presented the Russian conquest of Eastern Armenia in 1828 as the timely deliverance of a fellow Christian people, echoing the Stalinist trope of friendship of the peoples. In the post-Stalinist era, researchers continued to underscore the Marxist vision of a supranational proletarian movement that pushed beyond bourgeois nationalisms on the path toward communism. The second category of the historiography that I noticed was that even when glasnost and perestroika helped Soviet scholarship move away from ideologically driven histories of Russo-Armenian relations, they continued to bypass the contradictions of imperial policy and to outline a ubiquitous and to me still phantom, quote-unquote, Armenian question, Armянский вопрос. Post-Soviet Armenian and Russian historians have produced incisive analysis of diverse sources, yet the tendency to present Russians and Armenians either as allies or as foes have been slow to fade. Finally, the third major category in the historiography that I noticed is the lack of focus on the contingent, evolutionary, dynamic nature of Russian policymaking vis-a-vis the major ethno-national groups in the South Caucasus. So, I see the main contribution of my book to the existing historiography in my use of new imperial history, which builds off of post-colonial theory, that foregrounds first and foremost the contingent scenarios of imperial governance or repertoires of imperial rule. That methodology, combined with underutilized or even untouched archival documents from St. Petersburg and Moscow, and to a small degree from Yerevan, present a fresh look at the longue durée of Imperial Russia's encounter with Armenians. So, this is not the first such attempt, of course, but sufficiently different from the previous ones to make it worth the effort, I hope. With the context and the historiography outline, let's jump into the heart of my book. I want to begin in March 1841, when an Armenian student, an Armenian pupil at the very prestigious Lazarev Oriental Institute of Languages in the heart of Moscow, an absolutely elite and elitist institution for the children of wealthy Caucasian and Russian families to study not only quote-unquote Oriental languages, but also to gain preparation for admission into universities. In March 1841, an Armenian student at the Lazarev Institute smothered his hated Latin teacher's chair with so much glue that this poor teacher, after sitting down in his very nice, expensive jacket, was completely stuck. The poor guy actually had to be pried off of the chair by two of his colleagues. The archival documents for this are pretty incredible. The Moscow authorities, under the urging of the Lazarev administration, investigated this incident. As you can imagine, the administrators of the Lazarev Institute not only expelled the troublemaker, but also tried to banish him to his parents all the way down in Tiflis. At that moment, March 1841, the future looked very bleak for young Mikhail, and probably few people then could have imagined that within just 4 decades, the mischievous Armenian teenager would become the second most powerful man in the Russian Empire, interior minister and chief of the gendarmes, Mikhail Loris Melikov. This vignette points not only to how a spoiled brat can beat the odds to attain political stardom, a scenario only too familiar to us today, but also to the rare possibilities afforded by the cooperation of the Russian government and the Armenian diaspora. Loris Melikov and the Lazarovs are small reminders of how closely the leaders of Russia in its multiple iterations, from the Romanov Empire to the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation today, have engaged politically with the various diverse layers of the Armenian nation. Perhaps more interesting is the fact that these examples illustrate the historical fluidity of the concepts quote-unquote Russian and quote-unquote Armenian in the context of this multi-century encounter. Attempting to cover the entire span of that encounter would be impossible. I don't think it'd be advisable. So in my book, I focused on the long 19th century because I believe that is really the foundational chapter of modern Russo-Armenian ties. There's a little example of the early modern symbiosis between Armenian merchants in the Persian Empire and the Romanov elite. This case study of Russian imperialism matters for our understanding of how politically fragmented nations that claimed group identities open up new avenues for understanding the evolution of imperial methods of rule. It's based on the premise that by understanding the conditional and often conflicting Russian policies towards Armenians, we can glimpse the nuts and bolts of Tsarist empire building that was renowned or perhaps infamous for seeking consistency, yet flourishing thanks to differentiated rule. Looking beyond the reductive question of whether Russia was a friend or foe to Armenians, we can study the repertoires of Tsarist empire building in the context of diasporic distribution, interimperial conflict and alliance, nationalism, and fluid religious, cultural, and economic identities. Following the innovations of the new imperial history paradigm, I ask how contingent Tsarist perceptions of Armenian political identity vis-a-vis the state's pursuit of social stability and economic vitality contributed to the evolution of a complex yet generally symbiotic relationship between the state and the Armenian diaspora, the dispersed Armenian diaspora. Breaking with the existing Russophone, Anglophone, and Armenian scholarship on this topic, I propose that reductive friend or foe narratives lead to one-dimensional portrayals of a polyvalent hegemonic project. The crux of the argument is that for Armenians, and perhaps certain other subjects, imperial rule represented not hypothetical, clear-cut alternatives, but rather simultaneous, messy realities. Here's the book's table of contents. A key premise of the book is that Russia tried to harness the stateless and dispersed Armenian diaspora to build its empire in the Caucasus and beyond. Now, the contours of this story are not exactly terra incognita. This isn't something that's groundbreaking. A lot of not only specialists, but casual readers are familiar with the superstructure of the story. Many people know that the Tsars relied on the stature of the two most influential institutions of that diaspora, the merchantry and the clergy, to accomplish several goals. To project diplomatic power from Constantinople to the Caspian Sea, to benefit economically from the trans-imperial trade networks of Armenian merchants in Russia Persia, and the Ottoman Empire, and to draw political advantage from the Armenian Church's extensive authority within far-flung Armenian communities, not only in the nearby Persian and Ottoman empires, but also as far away as Central and even Western Europe and South Asia in Kolkata and Madrasa. Yet, this neat, artificially tidy summary of Russia's political approach to Armenians belies the reality that dramatic vicissitudes of policy and perception characterized Russo-Armenian ties throughout the long 19th century. And that really is the heart of my contribution. Entwined Armenophilia and Armenophobia on the part of Tsarist agents marked practically every encounter of Russian officials with Armenian subjects. Ethno-nationally and linguistically different, while culturally familiar, Armenians were alternatively and often simultaneously derided as uncivilized, subversive, quote-unquote, Asiatics, or hailed as Russia's most loyal subjects. If some imperial administrators resented Armenians as a liability, many others promoted them as essential allies. Given such diverse attitudes, I ask, how do we assess the evolution of Tsarist policies towards Armenians? What goals did the Russian government pursue through the conduits of the Armenian diaspora and religion? And how did Armenians contribute to or hinder Russian expansionism? Here, I want to highlight 4 specific themes. First, the theme of a direct partnership. During the Russo-Persian Wars of the early 19th century, there were 2 Russo-Persian conflicts in the early 1800s, Tsarist imperial agents sought to enlist Armenian spies and soldiers. These efforts were grounded in the Russian belief that Armenians, as ostensibly oppressed Christian subjects of the Persian Shah, would welcome Russian annexation with open arms. While hundreds of Armenian men answered such Russian recruitment efforts, the Eastern Armenian community also demanded that Romanov officials assign assimilated Armenian heritage Tsarist officials to lead Armenian units, to give orders in Armenian, to arm and supply them, allow their wounded to be treated in Russian military clinics, and exempt their families from taxes for the duration of their service. After heated, prolonged, protracted debates at the top levels of the government, Russian officials acquiesced to all of these demands. They acquiesced to every single one of them for the general reason that Tsarist empire builders needed Armenians almost as much as Armenian nation builders needed Russians. The second theme I want to highlight is the theme of Russian perceptions of Armenian religion and religious identity. A recurring motif of my book is the internal conflicts among senior statesmen regarding the government's stance towards Echmiadzin and the trans-imperial authority of the Armenian ecclesiastical leadership. From high commissioners to governor-generals to viceroys to ministers of internal and foreign affairs, successive groups of senior Russian officials disputed, argued about, and even resigned in protest about questions how to balance the socio-political and economic need for domestic control over Eastern Armenians with the geopolitical need for influence over Western Armenians. If the circumstances regarding the implementation of the Palazhenia, the Statute of 1836, are the most famous manifestation of this tension, then I elucidate many parallel dynamics from before and well after that date that coalesce into a more comprehensive story. Third, the theme of Russian perceptions of Armenian national identity is important. The book examines how the Russian officialdom encountered not a monolithic Armenian community supposedly united around its religious and cultural identity, but rather a fragmented, often internally polarized Armenian elite that pitted secular reformists against pious traditionalists. If the story of the Lazarev Institute of Oriental Languages is an ostensibly picture-perfect example of a partnership between the Russian state, Armenian social elites, and Echmiadzin, the headquarters of the church, then the story of a less prominent private Armenian academy in the Tsarist Empire points us toward other conclusions. In 1858, the Khalibov Armenian Academy of Feodosia in Crimea, Feodosia has been in the news for the past 48 hours for all the wrong reasons, opened its doors to Armenian pupils from the Russian and Ottoman empires. While Tsar Alexander II and his ministers embraced the academy and even propped it up with an annual subsidy of 11,000 rubles, Echmiadzin withdrew the backing it had originally granted to the academy's founder, Gavril Ayvazovsky. The Armenian church leadership, the Echmiadzin monastery, withdrew the backing it had granted to Ayvazovsky because the ambitious reformist priest operated outside the church hierarchy. Not only had Alexander promoted Ayvazovsky to archbishop during an interregnum in the church leadership, but Ayvazovsky also demonstrated more initiative than the heavily hierarchical church could tolerate. Elected in 1858, Catholicos Mateos wasted no time in summoning Ayvazovsky to Echmiadzin. He delayed his affirmation of Ayvazovsky as the archbishop of the Nakhichevan-Bessarabian eparchy, and despite the Russian state's and the Armenian laity's support for Ayvazovsky, the Catholicos, the supreme leader of the Armenian church, Mateos, launched a campaign against the maverick priest, which resulted in the demise of the Khalibov Academy by 1871. The fourth specific theme I want to highlight from the book is the theme of Tsarist confrontation of Armenian nationalism in the latter parts of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. I analyze how imperial officials engaged a multi-dimensional nationalist thread of Armenian political activism. From the early 1880s, bitter disputes raged among Russian officials in the Caucasus and in St. Petersburg about the aims, the motivations, and the real or potential consequences of various Eastern Armenian circles that focus on the plight of Western Armenians. Western Armenians refers to the Armenian population of Eastern Anatolia of the larger Ottoman Empire. In the early 20th century, we see the nuanced policies of Viceroy Ilarion Vorontsov-Dashkov, who reversed the repressive measures taken by his predecessors, such as the notorious High Commissioner Grigory Galitsyn, who had engineered the state's confiscation of Echmiadzin's properties in 1903 out of a conviction in the existence of a direct link between Armenian clergy and trans-imperial militants. The Russian government's confiscation of the Armenian church's properties in 1903 is usually viewed, and I certainly view it, as the nadir, the lowest point in all of modern Russo-Armenian relations from the early modern era to the 21st century. But Vorontsov-Dashkov faced opposition from Interior Minister and later Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, who doubted the Viceroy's insistence on the collective loyalty of Eastern Armenians to Russia. This led to sharp conflicts in which the powerful Prime Minister did not prevail because Vorontsov-Dashkov had key allies such as Foreign Minister Alexander Izvolsky, who emphasized the importance of regaining the trust. The trust was a recurring keyword of early 20th century official memoranda. Regaining the trust of non-Tsarist subject Armenians and reestablishing the Russian government's quote-unquote prestige among the Armenian diaspora after the crisis of 1903-1905. So by 1905, the Tsarist government, due to the pressure from both the Armenian leadership, the ecclesiastical leadership, the civil leadership, and from more reformist Tsarist officials such as the Viceroy of the Caucasus, reversed its policies and returned the properties of the Armenian Church, kind of reestablishing, I have to be careful with that argument, but trying to reestablish the original symbiosis from the first decades of the century. And so, these and many other examples leave us with several takeaways. At times fumbling for effective strategies, and at other times maneuvering dexterously, the Tsar's administrators, through trial and error, retained Armenians as a loyal service minority. Armenians cooperated with Tsarist aims through much of the 19th century because Russia represented both a real and an idealized guarantor of Armenian security and prosperity. Whether subjects of the Sultan and the Shah, or inhabitants of Russian cities far from the Caucasus, Armenians worked with and within the Romanov system to attain or hope to attain a better life. At times, they found that they had misplaced their dreams, and zealous Tsarist agents occasionally restrained Armenian material and spiritual culture. Overall, the Russian Empire's Armenian project yielded more triumphs than defeats, but the results were as mixed as the mechanisms of Tsarist imperialism. Now, let me emphasize that if the Russo-Armenian encounter appears permeated with inconsistencies and contradictions, then this reflects primarily the nature of imperial rule itself. This deduction emerges from ground now well tilled by the practitioners of new imperial history, who have effectively shattered notions of systematized central imperial policies and precise metropole-periphery relationships. These efforts have helped us to demythologize the vision of empire as a rationally organized and smoothly governed space. Of course, gradations of quote-unquote geopolitical success depend upon our understandings of imperial aims. If the architects of the empire sought to craft not just loyal, but also docile subjects out of national constituents, then Russia's engagement with Armenians ended in failure after a promising start. 8 decades of fruitful dialogue gave way to more than 3 decades of distrust and nationalist tension. However, if the primary goal of Russian imperialism was to absorb new groups into the empire and through them to increase the economic and socio-political vitality of both government and periphery, then Russia's recruitment of Armenians delivered tangible benefits to both sides. Like many Tsarist minorities, including certain Christians, Slavs, and Muslims, Eastern Armenians experienced official scrutiny inconsistently. A combination of factors which in various contexts outshone one another secured for Armenians a distinct position as being politically desirable. These circumstances included the familiarity of their faith, perceived degree of social, political, or cultural integration, and actual or potential contributions to states' priorities. Now, keeping in mind that imperial differences are neither quantitative nor qualitative, we can conclude that the Russo-Armenian encounter was naturally unique in some ways and not so unique in other ways. Specifically, one of the key features of the Armenian experience is diasporic distribution between the Russian, Ottoman, and Persian empires stands out as a distinctive factor because few, if any, other Tsarist minorities had such extensive connections to co-nationals residing in and suffering in other empires, other states. Moreover, the peculiar nature of this diaspora factored into Russia's political equations. On the one hand, the Tsar's Armenians embraced as their brethren large numbers of foreign citizens or subjects. On the other hand, no country courted Eastern Armenians or offered them a better life than could Imperial Russia. With all these themes and content in mind, we can outline some essential takeaways. Tsarist administrators conceptualized the South Caucasus as a space distinct from Russia proper in almost every way. But they welcomed some of its indigenous populations, such as Armenians, into the political project. Thus, in this episode of Tsarist imperialism, statesmen intermittently relaxed their Orientalist distancing between Russians and non-Russians, strategically integrating natives into the imperial civic and political fabric. In part because many Russian officials continued to suspect the political loyalty of North Caucasus peoples well past the end of the Caucasus War in 1864. And even in the South Caucasus, Tatars or Azerbaijanis often found themselves marginalized. Such statesmen as Ivan Paskevich, Mikhail Vorontsov, and Ilarion Vorontsov-Dashkov prioritized partnerships with the native Christian residents of the South Caucasus, such as Armenians and Georgians. From regional officials to imperial ministers, these architects of empire understood, and what's really interesting here, they often had to convince their colleagues. They understood and often had to convince their colleagues that indigenous cooperation was a key, not the key, but a key to maintaining Russia's regional hegemony in the Caucasus. Traditional dichotomies of power and resistance inevitably overlook the important cases of native agency in imperial projects. My hope, I took this picture a couple years ago in a monastery from the 14th century, about 25 miles outside of Yerevan. This is an inscription made in 1852 by Russian soldiers stationed there. And I asked the local priest what he thought they used to make this inscription, that it's been around for 170 years. And he told me it's a mixture of candle wax and a specific type of ash. It's burnt wood. It's not apricot wood, but it's a fruit tree that they mix with wax to produce this incredibly resilient writing material. It's unbelievable. My hope is that my book will nudge scholars away from the essentialist paradigms of imperial Russian Caucasian narratives. Too many accounts of Tsarism's contact with the Caucasus hinge on binaries, such as Christianity versus Islam, Russification versus nationalism, or modernization versus traditionalism. One of my key motivations for writing this book was to add Armenians to the ongoing vivid debates within the historiography of the Russian Empire, where the most recent studies accent the differentiated and contingent repertoires of rule. Historian Kelly O'Neill has summarized these trends particularly well. Quote, "This was an empire in which the line between integration and isolation could be maddeningly thin, in which power took on a distinctly formal cast on paper and a distinctly informal case in practice. This was an empire in which difference, defined in ethnic or cultural terms, and I would add religious terms, could be at once a source of empowerment and grounds for suppression. This was, above all else, an empire that strove for consistency and yet thrived on ambiguity." My hope is that we can use this book as a narrow glance at the impressive range of tools that the Romanov authorities employed to build the modern world's largest empire. Before I finish, I want to make one more observation. In the twilight of the Romanov dynasty, when empire-wide, quote-unquote, social pacification became the mantra of beleaguered officials, a new Russian conception of Armenians emerged. Reactionaries, rightist Tsarist officials, agonized over what they painted as Russia's own, quote-unquote, Armenian question, carelessly associating the terrorism of a few with the populism of the many in a misguided effort to collate the revolutionary agitations of the divided Armenian diaspora. But as the penultimate viceroy of the Caucasus, Ilarion Vorontsov-Dashkov, lectured the Tsar Nicholas II, to speak of an Armenian question in Russia was to project the internal circumstances of the Ottoman Empire into Russia. Undeniably, small elements of Eastern Armenian society, conspicuous for their polemical nationalism and bloody exploits, vexed Tsarist as well as Ottoman statesmen. However, it is hardly possible to trace the contours of an Armenian question in Russia that is more than a brief flash in the longue durée of modern Russo-Armenian ties. To apply that term to the Tsarist Empire's domestic political tensions is both to ignore the specific context of a key but fleeting era in Russia and to misunderstand its implications for Ottoman history. The idea that an Armenian question bedeviled successive Russian imperial administrators does not withstand the test of a broad examination. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll be glad to take your questions. Not all at once, please.
Thank you, Stephen. I encourage people to buy the book because there's a lot more to it. Questions?
Just a very brief question. What you've written is mind-boggling. But there's that old saying, all politics is local. When the Russians took over the South Caucasus, how much change was there in local administration? Who collected taxes? How are the taxes divided? How was it decided where what road went? How was water distributed? The local issues. Did the Tsar and the Russian Empire get into that level, or did they leave that up to the locals?
Thank you. For those who do not know, that's my dad. And this is actually, he's not just kind of showing off for the audience. This is exactly the type of questions I get on a regular basis during a dinner conversation at home. It might be just the three of us, and this is the kind of question he'll ask me. But for the sake of the audience, I'll say the Russians very much assigned local, not necessarily ethnic Russian, but local Tsarist officials who were responsible for all of these civilian issues. And they would engage with the perhaps previous local authorities, indigenous authorities, either Georgians or Armenians or Tatars or others, to try to understand these matters, but they would not leave key issues such as roads and bridges, or especially census and taxation, up to the locals to administer themselves. At least in the 19th century. In the earlier eras, it was slightly different. But by the 19th century, the Russians were very hands-on.
Yeah, Andy.
I'm Andy, a Ph.D. student in the history department here. Very interesting. I was curious, because in like the second half of the 19th century, did somebody start seeing the Tsarist Empire moving into Central Asia as well? So I was curious if you could speak very broadly just to sort of like differences between how like the Tsarist Empire is integrating or interacting with Armenian local officials or individuals compared to like what they're doing over in like what they would call Turkestan once they take it over.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like Robert Cruz's work over in that area.
Yeah, although Cruz's book is a little more about Orenburg, slightly to the north, but Alexander Morrison is really writing a lot on Central Asia. That's a great question. The Russians quite literally pivot within months of ending the conflict in Circassia in the Northwest Caucasus in 1864. Within months, they are launching a campaign into Central Asia. And you can believe that the lessons, the painful and the good lessons that they learned in the first half of the century in the Caucasus, the South and the North Caucasus, which were incorporated under very different circumstances and with different degrees of success, they applied those lessons to Central Asia. So based both on Cruz's work and Morrison's work and so many others, David Shimopennik van der Rohe and Veritol's, we know that they tried to co-opt, and they succeeded in co-opting as many of the local elites as possible. So that's probably one of the key parallels that we see, that the state consciously adapts from its experience in the Caucasus, especially the South Caucasus more than the North, to Central Asia. But there's also the very glaring parallel of military conquest and conflict resistance, which echoes more Russia's experience in the North Caucasus from the late 18th century all the way to 1864. So we see both lessons learned, embraced, and successfully enacted, and we see a pattern of fairly consistent problems or obstacles or whatever you want to call them in Russia's imperial expansion. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
So thank you, first of all, for a great talk. I don't think my question will be as tough as your father's, but I think maybe you should thank him for sort of sharpening your analytical chops for being able to introduce a great book. Also, this large amount of vignette is just this wonderful segue.
Actually, weren't you the person who suggested that I begin with the Lazarev Institute?
I suggested begin with the Lazarev Institute, but there's a glue.
Yeah, the glue. But I had a different vignette, I think, originally.
Yeah. No, this really is really stays with you. I would sort of avoid using anyway. The book is really good, and I just want to sort of pull out some of the tensions in this story, and I think what makes the Armenians an interesting group are some of these tensions, sort of loyalty, disloyalty, religious similarity, but not quite, right? With a separate church that's far older than Russia's. And then in particular, I was hoping you could say a little more about this economic function and the tensions around that. Because on the one hand, yes, I think there is interest in using the Armenian commercial elites and tapping into the trade routes and using them to develop the Caucasus. But as you know, there's a real deep suspicion among the Russian leadership and Russian aristocrats in particular, and really distaste for anything to do with economic exchange. And this is also, I think, really striking when we think about comparison to other diasporas, in particular Jewish diaspora, which is also at times seen as sort of useful because they're connecting empires and with these commercial networks. But there's a really deep sense of this is this sort of I think that this is sort of not trustworthy or not a noble pursuit, and so there's a sort of difficulty in entering the elites for some of the and then so I'm just kind of wondering if you could sort of draw that out a little bit, the sort of the ways in which this economic activity is seen as both a potential benefit, but also really something that's really looked down upon, both in the St. Petersburg, but also say among the Georgian aristocrats who are also vying to be these intermediaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I love this question. I mean, this gets to the heart of these inconsistencies and ostensibly contradictory Russian approaches and perceptions of Armenians. Throughout the era that I studied, the long 19th century, at least the start of the century to the entrance into the war in 1914, the Russian authorities have no idea how to really assess the indisputable fact that Armenian merchants carry some of the biggest supplies of cotton and grain and precious metals, especially precious jewelry, from Persia, from the Middle East, not just into Tiflis, but up to Astrakhan, and then from Astrakhan to Rostov-na-Don, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg. They also don't know how to deal with the fact that the Armenians, what they like to say, quote unquote, control the entire trade in Tiflis, the capital of the Tsarist administration. On the one hand, the Armenians are politically reliable, they are malleable, they are controllable, they're docile, they seem to be quite loyal. On the other hand, though, as Eric implies, there is this Russian, it's a very old ingrained general Russian cultural trait of not just disliking, but viewing commerce, business for the sake of profit, as an inherently dirty affair. Business, commerce, profit is necessary. The Russians always realize that, but it's something that they want to relegate for others, whether it's Jews or quote unquote Asiatics or quote unquote Orientals. They want, or perhaps Europeans, as long as others in the empire are participating in this necessary, not evil, but in this necessary activity that ethnic Russians don't actually want to fully embrace, the Tsarist state is more than happy to facilitate that. And the Armenians are a good example of how the government often oscillates between this semi-disgusted view of Armenians as the avaricious, greedy outsiders who are necessary to the economic vitality of this key borderlands, the South Caucasus, and as this non-Russian, non-Slavic, Oriental diaspora that quote unquote holds the entire trade. And I have all these documents where the Russians are scratching their heads about how the Armenians are not only pushing out Georgians from the various commercial sectors of Tiflis, but the Armenians are actively trying to prevent ethnic Russian merchants and entrepreneurs. For example, textile manufacturers from Moscow who tried to come down in the 40s and 50s, 1840s, 1850s, before the Crimean War. There is this hoopla in the Ministry of Internal Affairs in St. Petersburg because according to reports, anyway, this is too much minutia, but I think you get the sense that there is this real interesting tension in the Russian perception of the Armenian economic role. It's necessary, it's acknowledged as important and something to be facilitated, if not celebrated, but it is also something that can and is a cause for concern. And I know that sounds slightly contradictory, but that's really what makes this such an interesting case of the inherent messiness of imperialism. Yes, Susan.
Were the Russian elites accurate in their estimation of the Armenians?
Accurate in terms of what?
Or what you were just discussing in terms of their abilities? Or were they idealizing or stereotyping?
These were very much stereotypes that were grounded in certain aspects of reality. But whichever extreme you look at, they were almost inevitably exaggerated. So there's this real mythologized Russian perception of Armenia. Sometimes it's romanticized, sometimes it's just outright mythologized Russian perceptions of Armenian entrepreneurial acumen, innate ability. And there are these reports from the first decades all the way to the 80s, 1870s, 1880s, saying that the Armenians, unlike Georgians, unlike Tatars or Azerbaijanis, unlike North Caucasian groups, are endowed by nature, by God, by whomever, with this incredible ability to make money, to conduct trade in these quote-unquote backwater regions or countries that none of our people want to go to. And to some degree, it's true that Armenian merchants venture to the bazaars of Isfahan and the Red Sea coast, to places where no other Tsarist merchant communities would go to. But as you can imagine, in most cases, this was really exaggerated by the state. So, and this is another thing that Eric was hinting at. In the 19th century, in the early 19th century, emerges this Russian perception of Armenians as quote unquote the Jews of the Caucasus.
I've got a question from someone online.
Okay.
From E11.
Okay.
She says, wonderful, Stephen. A question. How often did Tsarist officials, and especially the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, make an issue of the Armenian Christian status as heretics from the standpoint of Orthodox Christianity?
Thank you, Dr. Levin, for that question. That's really important. It came up from time to time. It was most vocally and vociferously addressed during the debates around the Положение, the Statute of 1836. The Statute of 1836 both introduced obligations, restrictions, limitations on Armenian religious rights, and guaranteed certain Armenian religious rights. During those debates, not only members of the Holy Synod, but also other Orthodox senior elites from Moscow to Petersburg pointed out that apostolic Armenians are ostensibly heretical. They're not in communion. They must be treated as a distinct, kind of, not subservient, but a distinct category. They were generally overruled by the secular political leadership. And Paul Wirth has written about this. They were overruled by the political leadership, which maybe did acknowledge to some degree the ostensibly heretical nature of the Armenian faith, but did not want to allow that to become vocalized or exaggerated, amplified by the Holy Synod, by the Russian Orthodox Church, because it would directly damage the symbiotic relationship that the state was trying to cultivate with the church and with the diaspora. So this was something that ROC officials tried to bring up, but it never really permeated the discourse. It never really became a key focal point of either ROC Echmiadzin relationships, or especially between the state, the imperial state in Petersburg, or the local officials in Tiflis, and the Armenian elites themselves. They really kept that away. If anything, we have probably more evidence of cooperation between Armenian and Russian Orthodox ecclesiastical leaders. They often teamed up, to give you a specific example, to prevent Western missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant missionaries, from penetrating into the Caucasus. Whenever there, this might be surprising, but there are multiple examples in the 1860s of renegade Russian Orthodox priests, scholar priests, publishing kind of derogatory booklets about the Armenian faith. Every time that happened in the 1860s, all that Echmiadzin had to do was notify the officials, the church officials, the ROC officials, who would pull the strings with the Interior Ministry. The Interior Ministry would get rid of those booklets in a matter of weeks, maybe a month. I hope that answers Dr. Levin's question. Thank you, Eve, for that question.
Now that Dr. Levin brought up the question of religion, there's another religious relationship here, and that is the Muslims in Azerbaijan. We know that in Tiflis, the Armenian community prior to the annexation of South Caucasus was largely Armenian. But what about Baku? And what was the interaction, and how did the Armenians in Azerbaijan interact with the Azeris, and was the process different than what we were seeing in Georgia and the Yerevan conflict? Maybe I missed that.
So here's Baku. Early on, before the annexation in 1828, Baku is the local seat of the Khanate, the Persian Khanate, that is almost, not quite, but almost as ethnically diverse as its neighbors to the west and north. From the very scant Persian records that we have, it seems that it was majority Muslim, majority what the Russians call Tatars, what we now just call Azerbaijanis. But there was that diversity that was more prominent and is more famous in Tiflis and elsewhere. So we definitely know that not only Armenians, not only Turks, but also Jews lived in Baku before 1828. We just don't have nearly as reliable stats for Baku as we do for Tiflis.
Okay, well, we're just a little past class. Please join me in thanking Stephen for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.